Whenever I do an Unplayable video, I leave a comment asking for suggestions, and I usually get a ton of them, of many different decks. A lot of them used to be titans of the format, but then over time, they faded away, lost their power, and just don't see as much play as they used to. The decks we're talking about today are not these. These are decks that I can't even do an Unplayable video on because they weren't ever really playable to begin with. So today, let's go over some of these decks, the ones that we see show up at FNMs over the years, but never really at a top tournament level. Before we start, just a quick disclaimer, I am looking at these decks based on their success in Modern on a tournament level. All of these decks have shown up at FNMs across the years and have put up decent results and at smaller tournaments. But for this video, we're looking at their overall success at bigger events. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get started with our first deck. Oh, 8-Rack, how I used to absolutely despise you when I played Bogles. It's one of those comedically lopsided matchups in Magic that we run into now and again. Unfortunately for 8-Rack, its lopsided matchup was the rest of the Modern meta. For those who don't know, the goal of 8-Rack is to use a bunch of discard effects to rip your opponent's hand away, removal or ensnaring bridge to deal with whatever slips through, and wins with cards like Shrieking Affliction, the Rack, and sometimes Davriel to drain the opponent. Okay, great, so what's the issue with that? Something I've learned from playing around with lands and Canadian Highlander is the risk of attacking a resource that isn't directly threatening you. If you attack an opponent's lands, or in 8-Rack's case, their hand, you're making all of their draws much more live. And while this does play into the strategy of having them immediately dump it onto the field and reducing their hand size for things like Shrieking Affliction and Rack, what if they draw something that gives them value the second it hits the field? Or something that continuously gives them value like a Planeswalker? With the deck's main discard spells being Sorcery Speed, it gives the opponent a window to play something. Now this was more manageable when the best draws were something like Tarmogoyf or Death Shadow, but now every creature worth playing gains value when it or something else enters. That's not even mentioning something like Flage, which would love the discard. On top of this, what if your opponent top decks Interaction for your Rack? Well, the decks usually ran at least one copy of Mutavault as a backup finisher, but that just makes all of your opponent's currently dead Game 1 Interaction incredibly live. And that leads to the next issue. The deck really needs to win Game 1. Those of you in the audience who have played Best of 1 Arena Standard over the last few months have probably run into the mono-black discard deck, which is kind of doing what the Rack did in Modern, except in the Best of 1 format. And that deck is pretty frustrating to play against unless you have tools already in your deck to beat it. 8-Rack's just the Modern equivalent of that, except now we have sideboards. So if 8-Rack can't cheese out the win Game 1, that makes its matchup in games 2 and 3 and the chances of winning both of those horrible. What we're left with is a deck that really needs to win Game 1, and it does that by hopefully ripping its opponent's relevant cards away before they can play them, praise their opponent doesn't top deck something that can interact or immediately get them back into the game, and then just praise that the sideboard plan in games 2 and 3 works out. Oh, and don't destroy their Rack, please. Despite some small successes, due to the fact that these weaknesses have not gotten better over the years, and in fact have gotten worse over time, especially with ETB creatures, 8-Rack has struggled to see any meta relevance recently, or really in the past. Soul Sisters is a deck with a very simple goal. Gain 1 billion life and then win through attrition, or in other words, your opponent concedes out of frustration. The deck also went by the name Martyr or Martyr Proc due to its usage of Martyr of Sands to gain a bunch of life all at once, and then using Proclamation of Rebirth as a way to loop some of your smaller creatures. Great, terrific, the deck succeeds at gaining a lot of life really well. So what's the payoff for that? Well, in the past, two of the main payoffs for Soul Sisters gaining a bunch of life were Serra Ascendant, which became a hulking flying threat, and Ajani's Pridemate, another hulking threat, albeit at a slower pace. With the printing of cards like Fatal Push, these creatures could suddenly be traded with very efficiently, even at best and mana positive at worst for the deck. The continued printing of efficient removal made creatures that did nothing worse over time. Combined with things like combo decks that didn't care about your life total, combo decks that went infinite with their life total, and the overall pace increasing of the format, Martyr and Soul Sisters fell to the wayside. Until the printing of a certain 4-mana artifact. Remember in my One Ring video when I joked about the One Ring being seen as a great card for a mono-white commander deck? Well, Soul Sisters was the modern equivalent of that. And now, a powerful draw engine that ran off of life was the perfect card to slot into the deck. And you know the funny thing? The deck didn't win a single event during Ring's legality. Why? Because why bother with an all-in synergy when light synergy built around powerful cards just works better? The history of Soul Sisters is a perfect example of synergy being power crept in favor of raw power. Except in Soul Sisters' case, the synergy was pretty meh to begin with. But H-Puzzle, I hear some of you say, Orzhov Death and Taxes is back in the meta right now. That Orzhov deck is not Death and Taxes. I personally call it Orzhov Blink. Some people call it Orzhov Midrange. If you're not a caster, you call it Orzhov Sewers. It is not Death and Taxes. Death and Taxes implies taxing your opponent's resources, and running less than a playset of 2 cards that do that is not enough to warrant calling a deck Death and Taxes. It's why I personally like the name Orzhov Blink. The deck is mainly built around blinking your creatures for value, and the tax cards in the deck are just really good pieces to blink. With that out of the way, let's talk real Death and Taxes. That's right, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Leonin Arbiter, and Ghost Quarter, shutting down your opponent's ability to do anything. Awesome, great. Not good anymore. The deck did a great underdog impression over the years, but unlike in the movies, this underdog did not win out. But why is that? The plan on paper seems pretty good. The deck uses ways to tax lands, spells, creatures, and artifacts sometimes depending on the variant. Unfortunately, modern Death and Taxes is a deck trying to do its best legacy Death and Taxes impression. The difference was that in Legacy, the format was more consolidated around different archetypes that could be attacked by tuning the list. Modern, in comparison, is generally a more diverse format, meaning you already have to spread yourself thin to attack a wider array of decks. Thalia, while good against decks like Storm, doesn't really do anything against creature decks. On the topic of Thalia, another issue is that the tax cards were just kinda weak. Even with Thalia out against a deck like Storm, a single Electromancer or Baral immediately negates the tax, not to mention multiples send it back in the other direction. Meanwhile, in Legacy, they have cards like Wasteland, something that modern Death and Taxes needs 2 cards to mimic, making it way more interactable and far worse. And you really need that Leonin Arbiter out, because even against Tron, Ghost Quarter might not be enough to stall them out long enough, since your threats are at best 3 power and are usually a couple of 2/2s or 2/1s, which is something that Tron can just patiently wait and hard cast their creatures and threats against. Not to mention they could just play Oblivion Stone and then you're really rocked. This is a deck that demands everything go right for its pilot and everything go wrong for its opponent. Magic the Gathering has a lot of archetypes. Some are good, some are bad. Some are tier 1 threats with a ban imminent, and some remain 4/1 FNM champions. And that's okay. If everything was tier 1, brewing for a tournament wouldn't be fun. Each deck talked about today is a fun deck to bring to an FNM or to play amongst friends. But in tournament Magic, we have to draw the line somewhere, and each of these decks fall on the back side of it. It would be nice if in the future Wizards printed some powerful cards that could bring these archetypes forward back into the limelight to emerge strong in tier 1, but let's be realistic, if they printed cards like that, they would just get slotted into whatever generically powerful deck could use them better. Unlike the decks in Unplayable though, these decks didn't rise and then slowly fall and fade. They have kind of always been in more of a peaceful malaise, appearing at low-stakes tournaments and FNMs for fun and doing decently. And I don't think these archetypes would have it any other way.